Greetings. It is time for our monthly inflation update. And as always, we return to my familiar matrix where I take a multi-dimensional approach to inflation as one should. So my position has consistently been that all three of these measurements have to be above 3% before I say that inflation is structurally high. And even then, that does not mean that inflation is because of quantitative easing, at least directly. But until all three of these measurements are above 3%, inflation is not structurally high. That is the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. This is the most important measurement of the three, and the 10-year US Treasury yield. We take these 10-year windows in order to smooth out short-term blips because the news media is able to take a high inflation reading in 1 month and scare people who are desperate to see themselves as victims, and then the same news media does not emphasize months that have lower than trend inflation. But we look at all of those. And all three of these at 3% is what would actually be optimal, because that is when technological progress is the highest relative to the least amount of suffering for individual people, especially the poorest people. Remember that inflation is fuel for technological progress, as I describe in my atom thesis. Very few people understand that. And this does not mean that it's a catastrophe even if any of these measurements are above 3%. 3.1, for example, means slightly above optimal, and so forth. So we first go to the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield. The 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, 4.5%. So this is substantially above 3% and has been for some time. If I take the 2-year chart, you can see when it crossed 3%. This is more a measurement of expected future inflation versus past inflation. However, this has a tremendously huge impact on housing prices as well as lending in the broader economy, 4.5%. Now we go to the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. This is the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, 10-year compound annual growth rate, minus 0.86%. It is in deflation, and oil is cheaper than it was 10 years ago. It is in fact still far below the record high it reached in 2008, 16 years ago. And here's why this is the most valuable and comprehensive measurement of inflation of all. One, it is worldwide, so it is not dependent on the inflation of any one country. The US CPI is a US measurement, and inflation in the US is higher than in Japan, China, and the European Union, whereas this is worldwide. Secondly, commodities are freely traded, so it's impossible for this measurement to be rigged. Many people like to say that the CPI is rigged to understate inflation. That is not true. But nonetheless, the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index is even more obviously not rigged because it comprises of freely traded commodities. That is why people should use it as the ultimate measurement of whether the negative type of inflation exists and is harming people. And what do I mean by the negative type of inflation? Commodities are where indisputably inflation would be bad and deflation is actually good if in commodities. That is not true for services because wages are tied to service prices to a much greater extent. When services inflation is higher, that is simultaneous with someone's wages also being higher. The service provider got to charge more. So when someone says, well, the service I paid for became more expensive, but the service that I'm providing I can charge more for, but I'll only complain about when I have to pay more, not when I'm making more, that is absurd, and that is why it's much more ambiguous about service price inflation being a negative. That's why commodities are the purest component of what would be unambiguously good or bad. And a lot of average people who like to scream about inflation, they are not smart enough to understand these nuances because they simply assume that inflation is bad, deflation is good, because inflation means they're paying more, deflation means they're paying less. It does not occur to them that their boss will implement deflation onto them, eliminating their position, and therefore their salaries will go down by 100%. That's why a lot of people who think deflation is good, that's a pretty good indicator of low financial intelligence and low economic intelligence. Now we go to the US CPI. As always, this is the bls.gov website, and the link for this will be in the description box below, as with all other indicators featured in this video. And we see the CPI over here. The period of steeper than normal growth has been in the past for some time now. It ended in early 2022, 2 years ago, and since that time, this has again been the flat natural cruising speed that we want. And the 10-year compound annual growth rate of this would be this most recent number, 312, divided by the number exactly 10 years prior, which is 236, and then taking the 10th root of that time, because this would be the inflation over 10 years. What is the average compound annual growth rate of this over those 10 years? I'll have a table to depict that after I show you these charts. And we see the inflation blip is getting further and further in the past. On the 1 month percentage change of inflation, 2 month, 3 month, 6 month, and 12 month. Now this is still a plateau that is higher than what we saw over here, but isn't necessarily temporary for reasons that I'll explain. It is because of fiscal deficit spending in the US in an election year and to just expand the welfare state. Some of that fiscal spending is enabled by U.S. purchases of treasuries, but it's not the same as money printing causing inflation, because this is accrued into the ballooning size of the U.S. national debt, and there will be a time in the future when the national debt cannot rise anymore, and therefore all this surplus inflation created by borrowing from the future will in fact have to be reversed, because there will be a time when you cannot borrow any more from the future. Either that or the rate of economic growth will accelerate to such an extent that even this large national debt will seem small. One of those two scenarios, and I talk about that a lot in other videos. But the big spike ended 2 years ago, and now we're in this cruising speed over here. So now we go back to my matrix. So we saw all three, the US CPI 10-year compound annual growth rate, Goldman Sachs Commodity Index 10-year compound annual growth rate, and the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield. So today on April 15, 2024, what is the scorecard? 2.8% for the U.S. CPI. It's getting close to 3%, but it's still not there yet. That's why we use a 10-year window. The Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, the most important of the three, is still in deflation, minus 0.86%. And the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, this is the only one of the three that is above 3%. It's somewhat of a mystery as to why this has not caused a major real estate crash yet. The ambient momentum of the economy might be delaying that outcome, but this cannot stay high forever if there is to not be a real estate crash. Now let me show you a CPI table for further clarity. So in this March 2024 reading, the last couple of months have been high, 0.4% and 0.8% over 2 months, leading to an annualized gain that is well above 3%, but this is where the data is the noisiest and the most volatile. At the 6-month level, it's 3.2%, at the 1-year level, it's 3.5%, and then as you take 2 years, 3 years, and 5 years, you can see that that big inflation spike in late 2021 and early 2022 is receding further and further in the past, because over the last 2 years, inflation at the US CPI level has still been just 3.9%. That big one-time spike is getting further in the past, and that's why the 10-year compound annual growth rate, even including that big spike, is still only 2.8%. That's not even at the 3% that I would consider optimal. And in the 21st century, the entirety of the 21st century, there has been 78.3% inflation, and that is just 2.5% a year. The 21st century, and I talk about third millennium economics elsewhere on this channel, because the economics of high tech are deflationary in nature, and increasing money supply is needed just to offset that technological deflation. So no, inflation is not high. I don't care what anyone says. These recent months were a little high, but those ebbs and flows occur because until this 10-year compound annual growth rate gets high enough, there's not much point in getting into the weeds about why a certain month was higher. Also, this fiscal factor is independent of whether money printing offsets technological deflation or not, and the fiscal factor cannot continue forever, also for the reason that I mentioned. Now I want to take you to a clip of Bill Maher speaking with William Shatner, and they mention things that I have mentioned on this channel for many years, including how inflation is judged by the price of eggs, for which I have multiple videos. This first one you can see in the upper right hand corner. It's quite funny how hysterical some people get about the price of eggs being twice as high as it was 30 years ago, which is still just about 2% a year of gain. And then this other video, which is part 3 of a 3-video documentary I've made about how conservatives and libertarians have lost their minds of the subject of inflation. So we go to Bill Maher with William Shatner.
Okay, so how will persistent inflation affect Biden's prospects this fall? Does it counteract all the other positive economic news? Well, you know, every time I point out the positive economic news, somebody yells at me in some sort of,
But
somebody writes something like, oh, sure, it's fine for you, Bill Maher, with your private jets.
Yeah, but what is inflation? I mean, how high does inflation have to be before it's inflation?
It's when eggs cost more.
It's what?
It's when eggs cost more. That's
When
what
you love
people are
buy
upset
eggs.
about.
I know, but salaries are going up too.
Yes, they are.
It's a peculiar situation. There isn't.
What?
It isn't that bad, and they're just making it sound bad.
Don't say that. They'll yell at you. I'm telling you, you don't want to say.
So that clip was rather entertaining, but notice how Bill Maher mentioned eggs, and William Shatner, despite being 93 years old and remembering back when certain things cost 1/10 of what they do today, he did mention that salaries are in fact higher than they are today. And William Shatner is not an economist, not even a technology person. He is just an actor, yet had the common sense to mention, well, salaries are higher too, and therefore purchasing power is, of course, higher, even if prices are higher. This should be obvious, but some people have lost their minds on the subject of inflation. Just like many people on the left who are very committed to the environmentalist cause, they will cite a single hot day in the middle of summer as evidence of climate change or global warming. But inflation nuts will cite a single, extremely narrow anecdote as evidence of inflation, and they will not annualize it. They will say that if the price of something doubled over the last 30 years, that's proof of hyperinflation. No, that's proof that inflation is in fact only 2% a year, even in the anecdote that they provided. And I often hear that old people can't annualize things because too much time has passed and therefore they remember the prices of their youth, so they get scared by inflation. But William Shatner is 93 years old, and somehow he doesn't fall into that. Now, if you like this type of content, then I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching.